Welcome to another Indxx Insights Podcast, where we interview leaders in the ETF industry to talk about topics that matter to you. Today, we're joined by Brittany Christensen, Head of Business Development for Tidal Financial Group. Brittany, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So maybe we could start just by talking a little bit about Tidal. Tell us a little bit about the firm, how it started, and where it is today.
Absolutely. Tidal Financial Group is a ETF white label platform where we help new ETF issuers launch, operate, and grow their ETF business. We currently support over 200 ETFs with just under $30 billion in assets under management across the lineup. We support a lot of different types of products, and that's part of the fun of the job, I think. Roughly 75%, I would say, of our platform is actively managed strategies. And obviously, there's still a number of passive products. We started in 2012, grew our ETF business to what it is today, but really saw a lot of momentum once the active management approval process with the SEC changed.
Mm-hmm. Can we talk a little bit about active versus passive from a big picture perspective? Can you explain to our viewers what the differences are between the two?
Absolutely. So in a passive product where ETFs really first started, you have an index, and that is dictating how the assets in the fund are invested. So always tracking the index, no decisionary discretion made by generally humans, right, on the portfolio management team. So that's the primary kind of definition of a passive product. The active space has, I think, a little bit more variety for how you define active. There's a lot of active managers out there who maybe start with the universe of a benchmark and then refine from there based on decisions or real-time engagement that they want to have in the portfolio. And then you've got, obviously very active strategies that do not have any sort of index either, although many of the funds will still reference a benchmark for their performance purposes.
Interesting. So from a big picture perspective, a passive ETF will track an index. An active ETF has very different kind of rule sets, but it can also use an index in various ways, correct?
That's correct, right.
Can we talk a little bit about how an active ETF manager might be using a passive index?
Absolutely. So many active managers will often want to discuss their performance. That's part of the pitch to be in their fund, right? They're meant to be outperforming their passive peer group. And so they're really looking for that benchmark to help tell that story, right? So it's very important to understand how the benchmark is being utilized to capture that story, especially as an ETF investor, really making sure that the index that is being used in the ETF for benchmarking purposes is in line with what you would expect to see from the performance of an active manager.
Okay. And what I've also seen in the US and also globally is that a lot of active managers will use not only an index for kind of benchmarking purposes, they'll also sometimes use it for initial starting universe purposes. So it's still an active product. They're still doing the active management overlay on top of it, but they will use, let's say, a more broad-based benchmark, still targeted as a starting point to measure against. Are you seeing that as well with your clients?
Absolutely. We're seeing that trend where a lot of times people have a great idea to make a rules-based decision framework, but you want to leave some discretion for obviously inputting your level of expertise. I think we have a couple of clients in this realm, where they have industry knowledge from the venture capital side of the world, where really you're bringing their expertise on top and layering that on top of a custom index or a specialized index that would then allow them to exercise that discretion, but without having to spend every day in the data sets really defining the universe that they're investing in.
When a client comes to you, do they know what they want to do? Do they say, I know I want to be active or passive? Or are they not sure? And if they're not sure, how do you kind of guide them one way or the other?
Sure. Most of the time people come to us with a pretty set strategy. How they will manage and implement that strategy is sometimes a bit of a discussion point. Primarily for many reasons on the regulatory side. So being an active manager comes with different regulatory obligations, whereas being a passive ETF manager comes with less of those obligations because obviously the decision process is being made by the index itself.
So are you saying that if you have a passive ETF, there's more regulatory and compliance oversight than a passive product?
Yeah, so with an active product, you are required to become an SEC registered RIA, and then you are governed obviously by the set of compliance rules that the SEC and various regulators require of that type of registration. So there are different hurdles to consider, both from a cost perspective, but also from a regulatory risk perspective. I think sometimes we often find international managers looking to enter to the U.S. space, but having, I think, let's call it less appetite to be regulated by the SEC. And in that scenario, a passive product makes a ton of sense.
One of the things that we've noticed in the industry in the United States is that active launches for many years were far behind the number of passive launches. Perhaps it was because of regulation, maybe it was because of something else. Now we see active launches really starting to pick up. And actually, there have been more active launches over the last few years than passive launches. Why do you think that is? What do you think is happening that's causing that?
Sure. I mean, I think at the end of the day, you're really seeing this renaissance of active managements in the ETF, which was spurred by regulatory changes in 2019 that really alleviated the need for an exemptive relief to launch an active product, right? There was active product before then, but the SEC sort of took down the guardrails around it a little bit, made it easier for active managers to launch product more quickly. I think the other reality is that the passive world has had, let's call it, a 20, 30-year head start on the active space. And there's a lot of proliferation in that world. And a big factor, especially as a white label provider, we spend a lot of time with our clients helping them understand the competitive landscape. And frankly, the competitive landscape in the passive world is much more challenging. You've had incumbent players who've built scale. They've been able to reduce their fees. So being competitive with them at their fee level is a Herculean task, not to mention displacing the amount of trust that exists with some of the major passive players is a really challenging hurdle to overcome for many active managers or many new fund launches, period. I would say with active management, there's a lot more opportunities for you to differentiate your strategy, bring a new solution to the marketplace, and that usually comes with a little bit more flexibility in your pricing ability.
So one of the things we've seen a lot in the passive side is that people who are interested in launching a product will bring their own assets. Are you also seeing that on the active side? And if so, where are those assets coming from?
It's a great question. It is something we see a lot today. There has been sort of this knock-on impact, I think, of the active management, let's call it boom, where many managers are able to take advantage of what's called a 351 transaction to contribute existing holdings from various different types of structures into start an ETF. So kind of a bring your own assets, go-to-market strategy, if you will. Many cases you are able to leverage existing track record if you've actively managed these funds in SMA format. There's a tax benefit for the end investor to be able to port their gains into the ETF itself and then manage them via the ETF tax efficiencies. I think what you're seeing with this sort of bring your assets to the table is that you're seeing a lot of active managers seeking efficiency, whether that be tax efficiency or operational efficiency. I think that the genesis of being able to do that in an active strategy gives you more flexibility, really, in how you bring those assets in and then how you manage that on the forward.
So basically, if I think about it correctly, it boils down to the fact that the ETF wrapper is a better wrapper than whatever they were using before, whether it was an SMA or a mutual fund. The ETF is the better solution.
That's right.
Interesting.
In many cases, it is a better wrapper, right? There are still some cases where there makes sense to be a mutual fund, right? And so various different types of strategies that do not offer or have the ability to manage the same liquidity profile, for example. Right? So there are a number of use cases where we run into something and say this actually makes more sense in a mutual fund.
Right. Because the end of day liquidity versus the intraday liquidity requirements. And it rebalances all those types of things intraday. Okay, that makes sense. So, when I look at ETFs out there, personally, there's always a debate in my mind between active versus passive, and how do I choose which way to go? How do investors choose which way to go?
Well, I would suggest that every investor's decisions may be somewhat customized to them, but I would give some advice as far as really understanding how a strategy is managed is going to be very important in how you utilize that tool in your portfolio. I think the ETF space is evolving more rapidly than most of the education in the ETF world for the user base. And I think that sometimes we run into scenarios where product is out there and people don't know how to use it. And so I think, understanding where to go to find more information about the funds that you are interested in investing in understanding what's important to you in the construction of your portfolio. Maybe there is a slice for active, but you're only putting a small piece in there. So then on the whole, you're not paying as much money as you would, but you're able to differentiate on the edges of your portfolio. So I think that there are a lot of tools out there now that will continue to evolve, like such as Morningstar and other ways that we can use data and evaluate how funds are performing against one another. I think at the end of the day, it's important to recognize how much it's going to cost you to access that active management, and then consistently hold that manager accountable to delivering the performance that they're promising.
So looking ahead, Brittany, what do you see happening in the active and the passive space, in your own opinion, over the next few years?
Yeah, I mean, I think what always happens in the ETF space, which always leads with transparency, is that kind of it's a best man win type of scenario, right? So you are either coming to market with something differentiating yourself as I'm a lower cost provider than other solutions out there, or I'm able to deliver higher performance and therefore justify my larger fee. And I think what you see, looking ahead this year, I think we'll see a lot more innovation in the fixed income space, and that you will see more active strategies being brought to market in fixed income. I think the macro environment also supports that creativity happening there, whereas the environment for the last decade or so has not really been conducive to making a lot of differentiated products or strategies within the fixed income world. I think you'll also start to see, I have this conversation a lot of times with new managers where they don't expect how out in the open the ETF ecosystem is, right? So we call it the Terra Dome for a reason. Everything is public, everything is available to your investors, and they will be looking at that stuff to evaluate whether or not they're going to continue to hold your product. And you will usually have a little less connectivity with your investor base in the ETF wrapper than you generally would with any other type of fund, like a mutual fund where you have a direct relationship.
Yeah, you don't have the data on the ETF side.
You don't have
mutual
the data.
funds, you know who's owning your product.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's right. So with that lack of data, you're going to be put against your peer group, and then you're going to be looked at in a bucket of different products.
Yeah. So you think fixed income is an area of innovation and growth over the next few years? And just to dig into that a little bit more, you think it's, correct me if I'm wrong, because rates are where they are and they're expected to decrease, so you're going to have a good fixed income kind of bull market as we did from 1980 until rates bottomed out in 2008, 2009, right?
Right. Well, I would just say that the macro environment for fixed income right now, in this post-2019 active ETF world, hasn't really had its moment in the sun. And I think that's what we're going to start to see now.
Okay, great. Well, I can tell you from an index provider perspective, we see increasing complexity where more and more strategies are becoming more and more kind of tactical, more complex, more nimble, where we would build an index focused on a specific area 10 years ago that was much more strategic. Now we're seeing changes happening on a much more regular basis. Within the index, it's still rules-based and quantitative, but there are changes that are happening more rapidly. So I do think, to circle back to the initial part of the conversation, active versus passive, I do see lines blurring more and more in the coming years. Then the question becomes what's going to happen with AI as well. The SEC always tends to be more conservative around new technologies and black box type technologies. But I do see more blurring there if that is allowed to happen and creep into methodology usage as well.
Absolutely.
So, thanks so much for joining us for this conversation. It was really useful, and I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you very much for this opportunity.
So that's all the time we have on this episode of the Indxx Insights Podcast. Join us next time for another exciting episode as well. Thank you.